right. Hello, everyone. My name is Vale Gates, and I'll be the MC for the session, The Future of Humanity and Chinese Civilization. I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker, Brian Tse. So Brian's work centers around the big picture questions facing our global civilization. What are the most important issues of our time? How can we best address them through global cooperation? He currently focuses on improving cooperation over AI safety and stability between great powers. Brian is a policy affiliate at the University of Oxford's Center for Governance of AI, coordinator at the Beijing AI Academy's AI for SDGs Cooperation Network, and senior advisor at the Partnership on AI. Brian also regularly advises organizations such as the Open Philanthropy Project and 80,000 Hours on Global Priorities. Today, Brian will be discussing answers to the following question. What are the different ways in which Chinese civilization and its modern state matters to the project of safeguarding our long-term future? His talk aims to invite interdisciplinary research on the many open questions of this topic. As a starting point, he explores a way of thinking with the following perspectives. China's past is a long-lasting civilization for historical study, its present as a modern state with unique relations to existential risks, and its future as a rising great power with significant responsibilities in the world. One last comment before we get started. On the right side panel of swap card, feel free to share your thoughts in the live discussion board and leave and upvote any questions for Brian to answer at the end of the session. Brian will also be hanging out in Gathertown for around 15 minutes after the presentation. Without further ado, welcome Brian.
Thank you, Phil. It's such a pleasure to be here. When I began thinking about the long-term future many years ago, I had the fortune to meet with the late philosopher Derek Parfit over dinner at Harvard. His vision for morality was refreshing and deeply insightful. Parfit thought that there might be no deep disagreements between different moral theories, and perhaps they are just climbing the same mountain on different sides. His words have since inspired me to search for moral truth. And I think this doesn't need to be limited to between Kantians, contractualists, and consequentialists. This vision could also be applied to different moral traditions and civilizations all around the world. Many speakers at this conference have already argued that safeguarding our future is among the most pressing and neglected issues that we face in this century. Building on this, I would like to contribute the perspective of Chinese civilization in this talk. I want to suggest how a better understanding of its past, present, and future can help strengthen our efforts in climbing the same mountain, the mountain of possibly shaping the long-term trajectory of humanity. Very few people are experts in thinking about the future of humanity, and very few are experts on the Chinese civilization. So the intersection of the two sets in the Venn diagram is extremely small. In light of this, I have a modest goal for the talk. I will not be giving you any grand narratives, confident conclusions, or policy proposals. Instead, I would like to invite you to explore a way of thinking and the wide-ranging perspective and questions that follow from that. I'll conclude by welcoming you as people who are interested in safeguarding the long-term future of humanity to explore interdisciplinary research on this crucial topic. The past. Many of us are interested in the question of how our global civilization might develop over the very long run. As Churchill once said, the farther back you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. We can think about the birth, the growth, and the cyclic changes of the Chinese civilization, and try to ask questions that might be of global significance. And let's start with the birth. Around 10,000 years ago, early human civilizations began developing independently in different places around the world. One of these was the ancient Chinese civilization, with the development of Neolithic agriculture in the Yellow River and the Yangtze Delta regions. To improve our global civilizational resilience, I would love to see research on why certain aspects of the Chinese civilization seem to be so long-lasting. Between the 8th and the 3rd centuries BCE, major philosophies and religions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, and Judaism had become well established. The centuries leading up to this were described as the Exile Age by German philosopher Karl Jaspers. He was just amazed by their striking parallel development when it was not obvious that these traditions had ever come into direct cultural contact with one another. If we accept Jasper's thesis, what accounted for the moral and intellectual revolutions in that era? I assume that many of us would like to see a world where serious moral and intellectual efforts are being made around the world to safeguard the future of humanity. Given that, what can we learn from this intellectual history? Within China, this period was also described as the 100 School of Thought, an era of great cultural and intellectual expansion. It was fraught with chaos and bloody battles, but it was also known as the golden age of Chinese philosophy because a broad range of thought was developed. These include Moism, which developed a quasi-consequentialist moral theory, and the School of Names, which developed a kind of ancient Chinese logic. Now, you probably know Confucianism and Taoism better than these two schools of thought. So why have certain schools of thought flourished more than the others over the very long run? The answer might help us better understand the contemporary Chinese moral beliefs and how we can facilitate productive dialogues between Chinese and non-Chinese thought traditions. Now, let's move on to the growth of the Chinese civilization. In the interest of time, I will focus on science and technology, in particular, a puzzle that many comparative historians and sinologists have observed. On the one hand, China seemed to be an economically and technologically advanced civilization early on. On the other hand, the scientific and industrial revolution did not first take place in China, at least in the way that our contemporary scholarship defined them. I believe that insights into this puzzle might help us better understand the comparative advantage of Chinese civilization in science and technology in the coming decades and centuries. To appreciate the first part of the puzzle, it should be remembered that for about 2 millennia, China was the pre-industrial world's largest economy. The economic historian Angus Maddison credited with 2/3 of the global economic output by the year 1000 and still nearly 60% by 1820. The Chinese civilization was the earliest one to experiment successfully with aviation, with a kite and combing lantern, a kind of proto-hot air balloon, being the first flying machines. By the Song Dynasty, China had developed what has been called the 4 great inventions, including the compass, gunpowder, papermaking, and printing. And this was hundreds of years before the technologies were developed or deployed in Europe. In his magnum opus, Science and Civilization in China, Joseph Needham asked what is known as the scientific revolution problem. The question was, why didn't the scientific revolution first take place in China? Needham also asked, why did the industrial revolution not occur in China in the 14th century? A question that was later formulated as the Needham puzzle. At the time, almost every element that scholars consider to be a major contributing factor for the British Industrial Revolution also existed in China. I would just love to see more research being done on these questions. At the same time, this leads me to the point of cyclic changes. The sinologist John King Fairbank observed that, quote, China's history is a history of dynastic alternation constantly. Both the Western Han and Eastern Han dynasty lasted for 200 years. Later dynasties such as Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing tended to enjoy the ruling for around 300 years in the more advanced historical conditions, end quote. Such dynastic cycles seem consistent with demographic and economic cycles for most of the Chinese ancient history, though I think we need better data and scholarship on this. As early as 2 CE, China had a population of some 60 million, approximately 1/4 of the world's population at the time. Historical fluctuations of growth and decline kept dynastic China's population between 37 and 60 million over a period of at least the next 1,500 years. Throughout Chinese history, there also appear to be long economic cycles of 200 to 300 years, at least according to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research. The economic decline was mainly attributed to external shocks such as climate change and natural disasters. The centralized administration of the governments and the policies were also important endogenous factors for the economic cycles. This view of cycles is featured prominently in Chinese historical consciousness and moral thought. One of the key organizing concepts in Chinese history is dynastic cycles. Each dynasty rises to a political, cultural, and economic peak, and then because of moral corruption, falls, only to be replaced by a new dynasty. The cycle then repeats under a pattern of repetitive motifs. In the classics, the Book of Changes and the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese sages warned that the world that we live in is vulnerable, and that when it reaches its peak, it will fall into the bottom in no time. For me, these observations on the Chinese civilization and history suggest a cultural appreciation of impermanence. They act as reminders to remain prudent in times of progress, as well as optimistic in times of setbacks. I propose that these points might be important to carry forward into our global project of promoting the long-term flourishing of humanity. Now, let's move on to the present, the more recent period of history since the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Since China has a unique history and relationship with existential risk, we should develop a better understanding in order to create more constructive global engagement. I will now discuss Chinese perspective in nuclear security, climate change, and pandemic preparedness, respectively. In 1964, China tested its first nuclear bomb, 19 years after the Trinity test of the Manhattan Project. The Chinese leadership at the time believed that nuclear bombs were, quote unquote, paper tigers, developed primarily for strategic deterrence and not for actual use. And partly because of this view, China became the first country to propose and pledge no first use policy in the same year, stating, quote, not to be the first to use nuclear weapons at any time or under any circumstances. According to experts such as Taylor Frankfurt at MIT, later Chinese leaders share a similar view and have repeatedly reaffirmed its policy over the past half a century. China has also consistently called for a no first use agreement among the 5 nuclear weapon states. Climate change is another potential existential risk, and one on which China has shifted its position in recent years. Historically, climate change was largely viewed by China as a problem that had been created by and therefore should be solved by developed countries. In 2015, China announced its support of the, quote, common but differentiated responsibilities principle, which suggests that since China was still developing, its abilities and capacities to reduce emissions are comparatively lower than that of developed countries. Last year, China announced at the UN General Assembly that it will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. While it remains unclear whether this commitment will be achieved on schedule, it is encouraging that China is stepping up and is investing significantly in several key clean energy technologies. Another area of changing attitudes might be pandemic preparedness. During SARS in 2003, the recognition of the outbreak was notably belated. For COVID-19, once the problem was officially recognized, decisive top-down action with bottom-up cultural support was a crucial factor in China's eventual control of the disease. Recently, China's National People's Congress passed a major new biosecurity law. It aims to improve the country's defenses against emerging infectious diseases and strengthen regulations on the conduct of dual-use biotechnology research. In the coming years, it's crucial that the world leverage the tragic experience of COVID-19 to improve our collective pandemic preparedness in the future. And this brings us to the discussion of possible futures. Let's explore them with perspective including science and technology, great power relations, global public goods, political plans, and comparative thought. I know that my ideas are probably not very good, so to use a Chinese idiom, I'm just casting a brick to attract jade. I hope that my talk will attract much better ideas from you. Whether China has the motivation and ability to develop emerging technologies safely will have a significant impact on the level of existential risk. China could be a key player in developing some of the most transformative technologies in this century, including synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, advanced computing, geoengineering, and so forth. The prospect for safety, governance, and global coordination would require a separate discussion for each of these technologies. The international relations backdrop where these technologies will be developed and deployed matters. Some of the most dangerous arms races took place during the height of the Cold War and during the two world wars. As the former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, has said, quote, if the world order becomes defined by continuous conflict between the US and China, sooner or later, it risks getting out of control, end quote. So a core challenge for the great powers is reaching an understanding of a new world order in which they can coexist peacefully. There are many strategic concepts that have been proposed by both sides that allow for the coexistence of competition and cooperation, such as competition without catastrophes and banal competition. The future might depend on great powers recognizing the importance of existential risk and their shared interest in preventing them. The economics of global public goods suggest that China has an important role to play in global governance. Protection from existential risk is a global public good, with a pool of beneficiaries spanning the globe. But the nature of public goods create incentives for each nation state to shirk some responsibility. Take China as example. It has a population of nearly 1.4 billion, which is nearly 20% of all the people alive today. If it acts alone on the existential risk, it bears the full cost of the policy, yet only reaps 20% of the benefit. In other words, even if it had a well-informed government acting in the long-term interest of its citizens, it will still undervalue work on existential risk by a factor of 5. That said, China will still be one of the most important countries in providing global public goods based on its population size. To develop a better understanding of the factors discussed so far, it's important to learn more about the political plans set out by China in the coming decades. The path to mid-century has been designed in 2 stages by the Chinese leadership. During 2020 to 2035, it aims to build on a moderately prosperous society where the Chinese people are able to live relatively comfortably. During 2035 to 2050, China aims to become an advanced, modern, and socialist nation with common prosperity and global leadership in governance, science and technology, and culture. Understanding the deep meaning of each goal and vision will be important for efforts to bridge China and the world in the face of existential risk to our civilization. The status and responsibilities of great powers are defined not just by their economic, technological, and political might, but also by their power of ideas. There are several emerging schools of thought that might be of interest. For example, the Chinese School of International Relations seeks to add Chinese perspective to a field previously dominated by Western scholarship. In the past decade, there were also Chinese intellectuals who wrote books about the potential risk faced by humanity. Ultimately, I would like to see a community of scholars and researchers studying the comparative perspective of existential risk and the future of humanity. Understanding China's role in safeguarding the long-term future seems like a daunting challenge. It demands a deep understanding of the past, the present, and the possible futures. But the many open questions touched on in this talk also present exciting opportunities for research. So I would like to invite you to get involved in this urgent and crucial project. I believe that expertise in existential risk, international relations, history, different social sciences, comparative philosophy, and many other fields can all meaningfully contribute. As a closing remark, I would like to share a quote from the philosopher Annette Beyer. Quote, "The crucial role that we feel as moral beings is as members of a cross-generational community, a community of beings who look before and after, who interpret the past in light of the present, who see the future as growing out of the past, who see themselves as members of enduring families, nations, cultures, and traditions. End quote. Thank you so much, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Sorry. Thank you for that presentation on China's role in shepherding our long-term future, Brian. To start us out, I wanted to ask if people here wanted to get involved in this work, how would you suggest that they do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that if you are a researcher, I would encourage you to first get into the field of existential risk research at places such as FHI, and then orient your research to questions related to the Chinese civilization in China, like some of the questions that I posed during the talk. If you are interested in exploring relevant career paths, I would encourage you to look up an article on the 80,000 hours with the title, Improving Sino-Western Coordination on Global Catastrophic Risk. And if you are a student, then you might want to take some courses in East Asian or China studies. And if you could, you might even want to explore one of these questions as your summer research project or graduate theses, just to try out your fit. And I guess some of the ways for involvement depends on your particular circumstances. So feel free to reach out if you have specific questions. I and some of my collaborators and colleagues would be more than happy to help.
Wonderful, at all levels. I appreciate that. Second question, so what are you working on today and how did you come up with the ideas for this talk?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. My time is allocated in roughly two main buckets. The first one is improving the prospect of great power coordination in AI safety. And the second one is supporting talent development programs focused on those with China interest and background. So I think from that, there are two motivations for this talk. A is on cost prioritization. I think that there is a reasonable chance that risk from advanced AI and great power conflict will be some of the most pressing issues in this century. But I can't be sure. So I think it's important that there is a broader community of talent who try to safeguard the future of humanity from a range of potential risk, including extreme climate change and engineered pathogens and so forth. B is on kind of comparative thought and kind of this intellectual pluralism. So I have been educated in both the Western and Chinese thought, quite equally throughout my life. And so I would just like to bring a more pluralistic perspective to this community. I think that, and I hope that you will help this community develop useful perspective and engage with a kind of more diverse groups of scholars and as young leaders.
Very well. So this work looks to be quite comprehensive. What are you most concerned about and what most intrigues you of all the issues you've brought up here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I have a somewhat meta answer to this question, and it's from a kind of epistemic perspective. And people might see, this image from my slide about an elephant with a group of, visually impaired people, and I didn't have time to explain that. So this is a parable from the Indian tradition, and a group of visually impaired people heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. And out of curiosity, they said, we must inspect and know it by touch, and that we're capable of doing that. So they tried to do that, and when they found it, they, got really excited about it. The first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, this being is like a thick snake. For another person who, touched the elephant's ear, it seemed like a kind of van. As for another person whose hand was upon its leg, said, the elephant is like a pillar, like a tree trunk. So you get the idea. I worry that we become a group of, kind of visually impaired people who claim to know the truth of what an elephant looks like, or what China is, or what China wants to do. I think we must remain epistemically modest when it comes to this huge and complex topic of Chinese civilization and its role for the future of humanity.